What is a method in JavaScript? In fact, what's the difference between a method and a function? When we're calling a function, how is that different from calling a method? Let's take a look at that. We use functions a lot in JavaScript, and sometimes functions are called methods. Sometimes we refer to a certain type of function as a method. What does that mean? Right? Why do we call them methods? So methods actually come from other languages than JavaScript. They come from before JavaScript was around. And the idea of a method, really, the root of it is in object-oriented programming. Now, all that a method is, it's a function that's associated with an object. Now, in JavaScript, that association can be pretty loose. In other programming languages, when a method is part of an object, or in fact part of a class, if it's defined in a class, then that association is very strong. Like, you can't detach that method from the object. In JavaScript, we're a lot looser. So as a result, the definition of a method is also kind of looser. In other words, I would say a method is a function that's associated with an object, or a method is a function that is usually called as part of an object. So these are kind of loose definitions, but that's really all it is. A method is just a function. In fact, methods are functions just like any other functions in JavaScript. But I think it's worthwhile to start by illustrating, okay? Here I have a function calculate. All right. Now, a function like this, I mean, basically, what we're looking at here is a function call, specifically a function call expression. Why is it a function call expression? Well, because we have some expression that is the function to be called. In this case, it's just an identifier. This is the name of the function. And we have the brackets that would contain arguments. Basically, they would contain arguments if we had any arguments. That's the structure of a function call expression. We identify a function call because it always has the brackets here, right? No matter what is in there, whether there are arguments or not, that's how we identify a function call expression. Now below we have a method call expression. Why? Because this is a function. It's a function call expression right here, but it's attached to something. It's attached to an object. And basically it's a property of the object. The expression that we have here is an object on the left and then a dot which specifies the property access. That means this is a property access expression. In fact, here's how the computer sees this expression, how it sees a method call. The first thing that it sees is it reads this whole expression, and it sees that there's a property access. So this whole thing is a property expression. That's the first thing that the computer sees. And it sees it because it hasn't yet reached the brackets that indicate that it's a function call there. And this becomes the whole left side. So actually, I'm going to draw a parallel here. There is a parallel between these two expressions. Like, this is the function to be called, calculate. Well, that corresponds to, here in this example, rectangle.getArea. That whole thing is an expression which helps us get the function that we want to call. In other words, this property expression evaluates to a function value. And the way that happens is, well, first of all, we access the property. We access the property here called getArea, and then this value, well, we call that value. We call the function, but the function is a value that we're calling. Okay, that's what makes it a method call. That's pretty much it. The fact that we are first accessing a property and then using it to call a function. So that means that this function already exists on that object. How did that come to be? Why do we have a method here called getArea on our object called rectangle in the example there? Well, one possible way that this could have happened is if we had a class. So this is a class called rectangle. And it has this method here defined within. Now, one interesting thing about this method, and this is something that methods can do, is that they can use the this keyword. And this will always refer to the instance that we're talking about. But this is actually a really good question. What is the value of this inside of a method call? How do we know what this will refer to? Well, that is the key to answering that question is understanding how method calls are parsed. So I want to show you again this example, and maybe we can take a look at what actually happens. The value of this, there is a rule, okay? Anytime you call a method, in other words, anytime you call a function that's attached to an object, the value of this actually gets populated from what the computer sees right there in front of it. In other words, it comes from whatever is on the left of the property access. What is this object that we're referring to when we're calling the function? So I'm going to highlight the objects that these methods are attached to. But attached is actually the wrong word. They're not attached. We're just calling them from this property access. So once again, here's how you identify what is the value that will be associated with the this keyword. Well, we look at the whole property access. And yeah, sure, we have a function on the right of the property. But more importantly, we have an object on the left. And that's going to be going into this. That's the rule. Whatever is on the left of the property access expression, that will go into the value of this. And in this first function that I had here, I actually don't have anything on the left, right? Where is the value of this coming from here? Well, nothing. There's actually nothing here. And that's when there is a default value that replaces, well, what would be just nothing. In cases like this, the algorithm is simple. It gets replaced with the so-called context, which in a case like this is actually the value for window. So it's the window reference that gets put there because there's nothing else. You know, the JavaScript engine is trying to see what do we have on the left, and it doesn't find anything on the left of this function call, so it will just put the window reference. But in this case, rectangle.getArea, well, whatever is there in the code on the left of the property access expression, that will go into the value for this. In this expression below, where it's not a rectangle there, it's some other value, it's square, then the value of square will be put into the this keyword. So that's really interesting, and that's where we get this fact that the attachment between the object and the function, which is the method, isn't strict and isn't permanent. We can detach things. So here's an example. I have here, once again, my object here, rectangle, and I have this method, but notice what's happening here. I'm actually not calling this function in this example. If I were calling it, then I would have the brackets here after the expression, but I'm not calling it. So that means that all this is just a property access expression. It doesn't come with a call. I've deliberately not called the function. So we actually get the value of that function, and now it goes into a basically just a constant here. Like we have a variable that now contains that function, but it's no longer attached to an object. Now it's in its own variable. Yeah, we can do this. We can take a value from an object and just put it into a new variable, right? That's something we can do in JavaScript. And then we call that function. So in this example, it's interesting what's going to happen. Just like in the examples I just mentioned, it's going to look at, well, very simply, what is the value that comes in the property access right before, basically to the left. And it'll find that there's nothing. Why? Well, because there is actually nothing there in the code and we left it over here, right? We just left the rectangle on its own there. It didn't get brought along into our function call here. That's why we're not going to have a value in this to put, so it's going to end up being the window reference just because it's not there. So I hope that you're realizing now there's something really interesting happening. It depends on how you call the function, what the value of this is going to be. It actually depends. So if you call a function after detaching it from the object, then that affects what the value of this will be. That's really interesting, and that's really flexible actually. That's something that's very flexible about JavaScript. Okay, so like what happens if we go the other way? What if we detach a function and then attach it to a different object? So what I've done here is that I've actually just defined a new variable here, my rectangle. And this rectangle, well, I've just created an object literal. So there's no class involved. There's no real instance of a class here. I've just created my own little function, my own object literal, and it contains a width and a height. Okay, cool. So that's a very simple one-off object. It's not part of any class. But suppose that I still have my rectangle with that method getArea. What if I were to take that function and copy it over onto my rectangle, which I can do, right? Because what I'm doing here with this assignment, because this is an assignment operator, so all I'm doing really is copying that function over onto my rectangle. So I created my rectangle with a width, a height, and that was it. But then I copied over getArea. So now I have a width, a height, and a getArea. So what happens when I call that method, right? So I have my rectangle here, and now I'm calling this function that is newly attached, that I've copied over. And because notice, like as I said here, well, if this had been a function call, I would have had the brackets, but it's not. I'm not calling the function in that line. I'm only calling it here. Well, just like in the other examples, what do we get? Well, we get a property expression where the value on the left is going to be the value that goes into this. So now it's actually going to refer to my rectangle. And this works. You can try that out because as I showed you here, if suppose this was my class rectangle, well, the value for this is being used here to multiply the two together. So basically, I have a width on that object that I created, and I have a height. And my method doesn't care who it's actually attached to, as long as the value for this has a property called width and a property called height, then it's gonna succeed. It's gonna actually give me the result that I want. So that's really cool. This is a big thing about JavaScript, and like I said, most other programming languages don't have this flexibility. They don't allow you to detach a method from an object and attach it elsewhere. In fact, they usually don't pay attention to how a method is called. Usually you can detach and move a method call around, and it's always going to still refer to the original object, the original instance where it was defined. It doesn't have this behavior in other programming languages where it basically waits until the function call happens to determine, okay, who do I belong to? And it just picks who it belongs to specifically in that call expression. Really interesting feature of JavaScript. So to sum it up, what are methods? Well, methods are just functions that are associated with an object, right? That are called, well, here's the two possible ways to define it. Methods are functions that are called when attached to an object, but you could have another definition from the point of view of where they're defined. So methods are functions that are defined as part of an object, namely like a class, for example. But here's three things to sum it up. A function call is a call expression. So all I'm saying here is that when we call a function, what we're looking at in the code is just a call expression. But a method call is a property expression combined with a call expression. So whereas with a function call, we're talking about just a call expression, a method call is when we have a property expression first. Basically, the computer first reads that property expression, property access, basically, we're accessing a property. And then, as a second step, there's a call expression, and that makes it a function call. That makes it a method call, specifically. And this method call expression, that's what determines the value of this. It comes from the property expression that's there. And so in other words, because we're talking about expressions that get evaluated, that's why the value of this reference only is determined right when the function call happens. So up till the last second. You could say that JavaScript actually, look at it this way, JavaScript, it's like it waits until the last possible second to decide what the value will be of this reference, right? So it's really dependent on what the value is at the last second when you make the function call. And that allows us to move the function around, to attach it to different objects, or to just detach it completely from any object. And still, it'll wait until it finds out where it's being called in the code before it decides what the value will be. So I hope this is a good way to look at methods, to really understand what is a method. And ultimately, well, like I said, the definition of a method is kind of a loose definition. It depends how you look at it, but it's, I think, good enough to say that a method is just a function call, but that is associated with an object.